Good evening and welcome to Psychedelic Healing. I am your host, Sonia Cotto, nurse anesthesiologist and mental health advocate. Today, I have here with me is Richard Skaife. He is co-founder and partner of the Conscious Fund, investing in the next generation of global companies that's focused on solving the world's mental health and addiction challenges using psychedelic medication and treatments. He also serves as the director and chair of Microdose, the largest media and events company for the psychedelic medicine sector, and is an advisor to the Psychedelic Medicine Association. Welcome, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Oh, I love everything that you're doing. Mental health treatments have been stagnant here, and the options are just minimal for many, many years. And finally, you with the Conscious Fund are actually putting investment into the real future of mental health and treatment, which is psychedelics.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's been an incredible movement. I think we were, very, very fortunate to join quite early on in this movement, and it's changed quite significantly since, late 2019 when we started to look at the space, and early 2020, when we got very actively involved and we invested into companies, which are now pretty well known. So the Cybins and the Atides and the Gilgameshes of this world, and many more. And you're right. We faced an innovation dead spot for quite some time in terms of new treatments. And certainly psychedelics are not a panacea, complete enough to happiness for everyone and a silver bullet. But they do offer a real chance of hope for a lot of people who have simply not found treatments which have been effective for them. It's been great to have the privilege of working in this space since this new sector started to emerge. And that's not sort of doing a disservice to the decades of work which has gone before it. And I always try to be very conscious of the shoulders of the giants that you stand on, because if it wasn't for people who've taken enormous risks with their liberty and their reputation, the sector as we see it now, which is still only a very, very tiny sector, just simply wouldn't exist.
Right. Yeah. They did a lot of the research and the groundwork and the battles that we are experience the fruitfulness of now. So we definitely owe it to them, the originals that have sacrificed a lot. But you haven't always been in the psychedelic space. You have a history of music and technology. How did that transition that you were called towards psychedelics?
Quite beautifully, actually. The world of music that I was involved with was electronic music. And it's fair to say that, the two have proven to be interesting bedfellows. And actually, that for me goes back over 2 decades. And actually seeing incredible amounts of societal change through psychedelics being present in the electronic music scene. And what do I mean by that? 2 examples. The UK had a terrible problem with football hooliganism. And for your American listeners who are not familiar with the concept, this is where people go to football matches, not really to watch the match, but just to fight with other people. And they were organized into what you would call gangs. It was hugely problematic. It drew so many people in from their late teens and their early 20s. And this became their societal group. And these were their peers. And it wreaked havoc into the sport of football. And, city centres were not pleasant places to be if there was a football match taking place, because it would also lead to riots and all sorts of really, really unpleasant activity.
Wow.
And then electronic music started to find its way into culture. And a lot of these guys, and they were always guys, got into the rave scene. And I saw people who were deeply unpleasant football hooligans, so I knew through the areas that I'd grown up, become really balanced, normal people all of a sudden. And actually football hooligans were very rarely racist. There was actually, but they were homophobic. Absolutely. They were misogynist. But these people started to change their beliefs. And I would see people out at after parties, which were predominantly for the gay community, being frequented by people who had long histories and backgrounds of football hooliganism. and all of a sudden had this awakening and enlightening, had left that world behind them. And they all attribute getting involved in rave culture as to why they left gang culture. And then the other example of that is in Northern Ireland. And I remember many, many years ago doing a show in Northern Ireland, and it was a very big venue, concert-style venue. And at the very beginning of the evening, I remember saying to them, I said, is it a predominantly Protestant or Catholic crowd that we can expect? So, no, it's actually quite mixed. I said, but from what I know, they don't have mixed clubs. I said, no, this is one of the very few occasions where there is mixed. He said, so how it will work is at the beginning of the evening, the left-hand side of the room, that would be Catholic. And the right-hand side of the room, that would be Protestant. And there'll be an almost invisible wall. And these people could tell, there's no difference in, to me, there's no difference in their looks, their appearances, Caucasians, but they could identify each other through the variance in their religion. And they would have this invisible divide and they wouldn't mix. And then about 12:30, 1 a.m. in the morning, as the night progressed, there started to be commingling. And then, friendship circles started to be formed outside of those environments. People started to realize, well, perhaps they're not as bad as being laid out. So it actually brought people together. And I do feel that a lot of the peace which was found with younger people in those communities was actually through their involvement in rave culture. And for the very first time, actually meeting and, socializing and dancing with people who came from a slightly different variation of the same religious group. So that was, 20 years ago. In tech, one of my biggest successes and at the same time failures was an app called DigiPill, which came out at the same time as Calm and Headspace. Calm and Headspace are almost rewritten history because most people think of them as American companies, but they're not. They actually originated from the UK, and they're both very successful multi-billion-dollar formats. But there was a moment in time where there was 3 meditation apps who used to fight for the number one spot, and I was one of them. And they got on a plane and raised significant amounts of venture capital. And, now there are 2 of them. And actually, for me, that then led into a career in venture capital. But I always go back to what we were trying to achieve then. And I think we pushed the first version of DigiPill out probably 10 years ago, which was destigmatizing mental health. And we did that by making the product look cool. And even if you go onto Instagram today and search the hashtag DigiPill, you will find people putting screenshots of a mental health app onto their profile and talking about the fact that it's cool and it's helped them, it looks really nice. So we kind of felt that the best way of destigmatizing using a mobile app to help your mental health was to place really high quality design front and center of that proposition and make it cool and then make people talk about it. And for me, the eureka moment of that business was not when we got to 50,000 downloads or 100,000 downloads, or when Stephen Fry tweeted about it, or when Apple, did a feature on it. It was when people were taking screenshots and putting it on their Instagram because they're actually saying, I'm using a mental health app and I've got no shame in the fact that I'm using a mental health app. So that, for me, that led to a career in venture capital. Like I became very disillusioned in the areas that I was investing into, and kind of reflected in terms of where had I got the most sort of meaning in my own life. And that was the work that I did with DigiPill. And when I was introduced to Henri, who's my co-founding partner at the Conscious Fund, I actually hadn't joined the dots. I'd already had significant amounts of impact and understanding from seeing psychedelics in action, delivered significant amounts of talking therapy to probably millions of people through DigiPill. But I've never realized that when you combine the two, there's an immensely powerful force. So when he spoke to me about it, and originally I'd gone in purely to sort of look at, you could sort of structure things, so, doing all of the boring stuff as it is, I just sort of had that eureka moment. I was like, oh my God, it's there. It's in plain sight. I've already been doing this. How can I get involved? And that was 4 years ago. And yeah, it's been
it seems like it's so long. There's been so much going on in the last 4 years.
It has, and I think some of the things that we touched on and talked about very, very early on were viewed as being unrealistic, unachievable goals in the next decade. And those are goals which have already been achieved. So, what's been happening in, the US states at a state level was stuff which was not even on the agenda. There was people committing huge amounts of time and energy to it, but it hadn't started to really manifest through the political process. So it's been really incredible to see things which we talked about as nice to haves actually now being achievable. And, you look at the work that's being done in the ketamine centers, you look at the success that Johnson & Johnson have had with Spravato, you look how close that maps are, you look at, last year we had the FDA at Wonderland deliver a keynote to the psychedelic medicine industry on how you can have a better working relationship with the FDA. And there was always this bogeyman being perceived of the regulator doesn't want to help these medicines come to market. And when they're prepared to stand on a stage and talk to the industry about how they can actually get these medicines to the market, I think that shows an absolute willingness to help. So, I think for me, those were really important.
Yeah, it's been quite the transition, because even when I began, you started in 2019. 2019 is actually when I discovered, because I've been doing anesthesia, I've been using ketamine for years before discovering its use in mental health, and then in 2020, and even still now, I'm educating and teaching different providers, psychiatrists, therapists, its use, because there is still that stigma, the resistance to try anything outside of the pharmaceutical options.
Absolutely. And I think, this is a big challenge that we're still going to come up against. Sort of preventative and functional medicine is not taught to MDs, GPs at this day. Novel and new mechanisms of care are not taught to psychiatrists and psychologists. I brought a friend of mine over from Malta who's a British psychologist. He's got something like 50,000 hours of practice and works some of the most complex cases and individuals. He had no awareness at all before he met me of psychedelics, and he's actually heavily involved in PTSD and trauma. He kind of knew about it. So this is an incredible, very open-minded guy, was comfortable getting on a plane from our little island here, and traveling all the way to Miami to find out more about it. Had a wonderful time, but it's like, nobody's talking about this. I'm a PTSD and trauma expert, and this is just not being talked about. And I think this is going to be, one of the big sort of futures of modality that we use, but it's just not being talked about. So there's a huge amount of work which still needs to be done with medical practitioners, with regulators, and I think sometimes in the Western world, we perceive that we are so much further ahead than all the other markets. It's like, no. I mean, if you look at indigenous communities, this has been, this has been used for, but even Middle Eastern markets. A conference very recently on this category, and I have a team at the moment who are looking at opening, psychedelic, ketamine-centric propositions in jurisdictions where people will perceive that this will simply never happen, where market access has already been granted for products like Spravato. And, it's incredible that these things are happening, and just things that I don't think we perceived would happen so quickly.
Yeah. And even with all the, obviously 2020 with COVID was definitely a big hit to the world, but really just threw mental health out into the forefront, and where people didn't talk about it, they talked about it. So even with your app, the DigiPill, that was the fact that you got so much traction back then. Imagine its opportunity now, where it's at. All these apps are coming out, even different therapy apps and all that. My concern and my question is, in the future of psychedelics. We have this amazing, Rick Dobla did such amazing work with MAPS, and we're, rolling out now the scheduling change for MDMA and therapy. But where do you see the future? My concern is, where are all these practitioners going to be trained, and how are we going to provide the amount of trained specialists?
It's a really good point. One of the shortcomings I felt that the venture capital community has made towards its service of this industry category. I try and avoid using the word industry category. Mm-hmm. Industry always sounds a bit sinister. But this category is that they've not looked at it as a whole. And some people have been absolutely obsessed with only investing into biotech and next chemical entities. And I'm like, well, this is great. I can understand your perception around, the alpha, the return that you'll make from, being a very early investor into a blockbuster drug. But where are these clinics that people are going to go to? Who's going to train those therapists? And how are people going to find those clinics? Who's lobbying insurance companies? Who's talking to doctors to make referrals? Who's doing all of this? Because if you are fortunate enough to be involved in a category at its very, very early stages, got to try and look at it like a whole. Because if you don't have all of those pieces ready to be joined together, something will undoubtedly fall over. And I think, training, there's some great groups out there, well capitalized, developing, and delivering training programs. I've been fortunate enough to be involved with a team who are putting healing commercial real estate, and that will be a way that clinic providers and clinicians can get access to real estate, which is fit for purpose. Because without all of those things, it is going to make it really, really difficult for a new chemical entity to come into the market and be successful. So yeah, there's still an inordinate amount of work which has to be done, and we've got to look at the psychedelic medicine category, as a whole, not just our individual molecules.
Right, because even for my clinic, I would love to offer all modalities as they become legalized. Right now, I have ketamine, which we're doing amazing work with, but there are some patients that still continue to struggle, and then will need further different medicines to go a little bit deeper or work on different receptors in the brain. But how, as a clinician, will I be able to offer it? And, because some of the medicines last so long, 8 to 12 hours, depending, how do you provide a trained therapist, psychiatrist, or any facilitator to sit with the patient for that long, and then continue to provide that the next day and the next day after that? That's very tolling and taxing on the mind,
I think it is. And I mean, down to the way that the physical location is set up, the sort of pre-support work which has to be done, the post-support work which has to be done, the duration of the actual trip itself. So there's a lot of stuff that's called the protocol layer, which heavily impacts on the economics around accessing these treatments. And I do think that's, in the future, I don't think we're there yet, because this is going to take a leap of faith for people to get comfortable with it. There will be technology which can support that, so you're not totally reliant on having, say, 2 therapists in the room. One of them could be a trained therapist. The other can be a highly intelligent tool, which is monitoring the patient, which I also think will take away, some of the issues that we've experienced with regards to, potential for abuse. So there is undoubtedly going to be a role that technology will start to play in this sector in the future.
With the biotech companies, and then the ones that you, for example, Cybin, the Gilgamesh, and others, when they are looking for, they're trying to create their own molecules, their own medicines, similar to what we have in just plain medicine, like the psilocybins, MDMAs, and whatnot. Are you privy to their goals for these? Is it shorter duration of action, and what their goals are for making these substances that technically already exist naturally?
They evolved. And I think it's fair to say that nearly every biotech company that we invested into very early on does not have the same endpoints of success at this juncture now. It's a process of iteration. For us, it's about looking at very smart, passionate people and backing them very early with a realization that, what they're looking at right now may not be what they're looking at 12 months from now. I mean, there are undoubtedly different scales. They do range from people who've got, faster duration, faster acting, the ability to be more effective through the way that it's ingested. But there are people also, looking to call on different receptor pathways, develop whole new fields of consciousness. There are people who are developing non-psychedelic psychedelics, which I think we've settled on plastogens as being as the term of phrase. Yeah.
I like that.
Which I think my view for therapy is the trip is an important part of it. That's part of the journey. I think where those medicines will be really interesting and really important is when we're looking at things like stroke recovery, when we're looking at things like dementia, so neurodegenerative illnesses. That's where you really want to play with that molecule, and you don't want the trip to be part of it. But for when you're working, in the mental health and addiction field, I think that's going to be a really important part of it. Certainly if you're working in the addiction field and you're working with something like an ibogaine, then you want to be looking at how you can increase the safety profile of that. And that's where there's validity in terms of not tinkering with the trip, but tinkering with some of the cardiovascular issues that can occur with ibogaine, increasing the safety protocol. But yeah, that's... there's a lot of companies are all looking at doing very, very similar things super early on in this space, but most of them have evaporated. The ones who were the most legitimate and the ones who got the most serious scientists and experienced management teams are the ones who are still around today.
A few of them are actually being funded through the Conscious Fund, so you've definitely done a lot of work. And how do you decide when you're going through the Conscious Fund? Because there are so many, obviously, in this field of psychedelic medicine. All these funds, all these companies are probably coming in at it. And how do you actually evaluate the companies and decide their future success and what's something that you want to put your money towards?
So first of all, we don't make a decision as non-scientists on science. We have scientific support and scientific advice. And sometimes the depth of the report will vary from a very detailed sort of critical analysis to one-liners saying, no way, junk, to others, wow, there is definitely something here. And what usually happens is it's a very senior scientific person from the organization having a conversation with one of our elected scientific advisors. And we keep management and entrepreneurs out of that conversation, so it's not a sales process, and they're nerding on the science. And then we look at that. And then really you're looking at the entrepreneurs and their passion and their conviction, and try to understand why they wanted to get into this space. I think most people who are coming into this space now, extremely well-meaning. It's a very hard market to raise capital in, and you've got to have a true amount of conviction. In 2020, in the early part of 2020, it really did feel like all you had to do was put a picture of a mushroom on the front of your deck, borrow some wording from other people's decks, stick a few names on there, talk about a reverse takeover, listing it in Canada, and we're all going to make a load of money, and you would raise a couple of $1 million. Thankfully, we managed to avoid those type of companies. So we always kind of go back to those sort of fundamentals. From a scientific perspective, these businesses will evolve. they go on a journey of discovery. They're very, very early on. And, are the scientific people smart enough to identify that they've got a challenge and a problem with their initial approach? Are they pragmatic? Can they weather criticism, critique? Will they make amends, or will they just continue blindly down a path and eventually, the trial candidate fails? Or can they be quite agile? And then quality of management. And, if somebody is telling me that, ultimately their ambition is to be acquired by a big pharma company, and, their previous background was a tech entrepreneur, running a small social network, it's not that believable, because, they don't understand the culture of big pharma companies. They don't have any relationships with M&A teams. They don't know necessarily what they're looking for. They're not following their own drug development programs. So you kind of take that with a pinch of salt. Not to say that they can't achieve it, but it's just a little bit less likely from a probability perspective. If the individual has spent most of their career inside big pharma, and they've bounced around different departments, and they've been responsible for bringing drug tracks into market, and they've had a company being previously acquired by them, then it starts to look a lot more promising. Doesn't mean that they're not going to still have failure, because the failure could take part in the clinical side, and unlikely, during due diligence that, big, medium pharma companies going to want to acquire, something which is ultimately going to cost them a lot of money and fail. They do, but they try and avoid it. And that starts to then be more believable. And then I think the third thing really is, do you like these people? Do you get on with them? Do you feel inspired by them? Are you going to enjoy working with them? You could well be, on a journey with them for longer than some marriages last. You kind of want that. And that's hard to quantify, because sometimes they can be incredibly arrogant, incredibly driven, incredibly strong-willed. And, that can sort of rub you up the wrong way. But then you've got to sort of look at that and say, look, they've got passion, they've got drive, they've got real conviction. I kind of like that. Probably wouldn't want to have a beer with them. Probably drive me, to distraction. But I kind of see that what they've got there as a quality. And the other thing is you're trying to watch for where you're being fed BS. And there was a company very, very early on. I won't name them, but I got to see the CEO of the business who was in London just before the pandemic really sort of kicked in. And in their deck, they talked about a number of achievements and significant amounts of intellectual property that they held. And, as I was sort of wrapping up, I said, where's next? Where are you traveling to next? And they gave me the name of the country where they were going to. And I said, what are you going there for? I said, it's to sign all the IP deals. Thinking to myself, the same IP, what you've already got in your deck, and you're 85% of the way into your financing, and you haven't signed them. I mean, as it happened, they did sign them. But for me, that was just like, if I call you out on that, what else isn't true? And, we shied away from that one. Probably could make quite a bit of money on it if we'd have exited at the right stage. But I just felt it was such a big, you're always, I think, quite forgiving of people being overly optimistic with their sales figures, overly optimistic with their clinical pipelines. But when something so fundamental as core intellectual property of your business is yet to be fully absorbed by your business, but you're representing to investors and you've taken money off them, then that for me was just like, sorry, not something we can get involved with.
Yeah, integrity is very, very important. And especially in a conscious fund when you're doing a lot of hard work. We did talk a lot about the business aspect of it and the medicinal, the pharmaceutical, but the conscious fund also does a lot of education pieces, as founder or co-founder of Microdose. You have the Wonderland education piece, this conference that's happening in a few weeks here, but also the third wave. I honestly have been using them as a resource for patients because obviously, psilocybin isn't legal and people want questions and ask about microdosing and what are different questions about psychedelics that I've been using the third wave, as a resource to give to patients.
Yeah, I think we were one of the very early investors in the third wave, and they do a brilliant job of the consumerization of psychedelic medicine and access. And actually, in many ways, was kind of the inspiration for us helping to create Microdose, because we kind of looked at it and said, right, got a number of, media properties who are doing an amazing job in terms of communicating this to mass populace, who's talking about this as a sector. And, as the world was in its first spin of the lockdown, we did our very first virtual event. And I always look back at it, very, very humbled. Its purpose was actually to raise the profile of a number of the companies we'd already invested into. So that was Ibid and Gilgamesh and Atai and Diamond, Third Wave, Bexon. So I thought, well, we've got a couple of friends. So we maybe will have, 7 or 8 speakers, and it's a virtual event. Nobody's ever really been to one of those before. If 50 people come along, we've done really, really well. And, they then, one of those speakers would say, it'd be great if you had a panel on this. Can I invite so-and-so and so-and-so? And then that person would say, it'd be really great if we had a panel on this. If I could invite this person. And before we knew it, we ended up settling on north of 105 speakers. The event ended up running for 2 days. We had between 12 and 1,400 people come along to the first virtual event. I was sat in my lounge when I was living in London about 4, 5 o'clock in the morning at a virtual Zoom after party with Rick Doblin as he was smoking his bong and showing people stories of his life, and, what he'd done. And I mean, it was an awful moment in time. And in terms of where we all were, and pretty much everybody in the world was locked down at the time. Nobody had started to ease restrictions, but it really brought everybody together. It's so encouraging to see so many people in the chat window who'd been looking at this as a potential sort of career path, young people doing their PhDs, and sort of settling. And this is the area that we wanted to work in. And we'd see this amazing, sense of community. And then getting emails from people after the event saying, thanks so much for putting this event on. I met a group of investors. I raised a significant sum of money for my company. And it's all thanks to attending your virtual event. I found them in one of the Slack channels we were running. So like things that we never anticipated were going to happen ended up happening, which was really a lot of our motivation for bringing Wonderland to life. And it was like, listen, we had to do it as a virtual event then, but, we know that these forums are so important. Why don't we take the jump and see if we can be the first out of the traps to put on a, large event, which is predominantly for people who are working in the category, but also includes people who are advocates from community, from a religious background, from military background. Let's not exclude anybody. But let's focus this in on people who are working in the category. And it's been really fascinating to see at those events. Like the first event, a lot of people, were working in more conventional sort of drug discovery companies. So, they've been working with CNS medicine. They're now in the psychedelic space. First day at a conference, they turn up in a suit. And,
Yes.
They're seeing people walking around with like color and costumes. And then later that afternoon, they'd reappear. And they were like, oh, this is so refreshing. And I know I'm not supposed to say this because I'm at a business conference, but I'm really enjoying myself. Can I get an extra ticket for my wife? Because I actually think she'd be fascinated to learn what I'm doing. I'd never invite her to one of my normal conferences because she would just be so bored. I think she's going to really enjoy this. And then they would turn up with their partner on the next day. And that's what we really wanted to create with that format was, something which is fun and immersive and educational, but at the same time where people come together and business gets done. And there's been so many great businesses and companies and venture capital funds, which have all been, incubated, inside the Wonderland event, and many teams, especially at the first event, were meeting for the first time.
That was my first conference, actually. My first psychedelic conference was there in Wonderland.
But these are people who have worked together in a virtual setting, and they've never actually physically met their team members. And I remember Josh, who's the editor-in-chief at that now Psychedelics Alpha, and Graham, who's one of the very well-known attorneys in the space. Graham said to me, he said, "Oh, have you seen Josh yet?" I said, "No, I don't think he's arrived." He says, "I'm so looking forward to meeting him." I said, "You've never met?" He said, "No, never met. We've had this virtual relationship, and we did all of this amazing content, but yeah, we've never ever met." And I walked to the front door and I wait for Josh to arrive, and I took him in and I said, "Graham, Josh, meet each other together for the first time." And there was so many of those things happening, and that was really beautiful to see.
Yeah, no, the camaraderie, and yes, seeing business, venture capitalists, shamans, and medical professionals. I'm a clinician. It was just a mosh posh of everyone, and it was all about.
And I think it shows people can coexist. There was a lot of healthy skepticism about the role that venture capital play in this space. We don't have the best reputation as a sector. Some of it's deserved, some of it I think is undeserved. You always got to look at what somebody's sort of true north is. But it did show that people can sort of coexist, and there'll be huge amounts of respect, and people have got a willingness to learn. And one of the most amazing things that I actually saw at the first Wonderland was an ex-Navy SEAL who'd come off stage, and a medicinal chemist had gone over to them to talk to them about how PTSD manifests, what it feels like. And then this ex-Navy SEAL was asking with this. I was just listening in on this conversation. Fascinating. Was explaining how they create medicines and how these things get, come to market. And they left with like this amazing sort of respect to each other. And they said, "Thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for everything you're doing." And I just thought to myself, in what bar in America would you find an ex-Navy SEAL and a medicinal chemist having this type of conversation? So those kind of moments are always really special.
Well, and then there is a market for everyone. There are the biotech companies. People are, the traditional medicine, the plant medicine community doesn't like the biotech companies. And there's that. I experienced it actually at the Wonderland conference. I saw, different conversations and that. But there is a space for everyone, because there is going to be the community that goes to the plant medicine, but then there's the community that goes to the clinics and want the they want the psychedelic benefits without the psychedelic experience. Though, like you, I agree that the experience is very important.
Yeah, I mean,
there's space for everyone.
This is the thing. I think some people go off on a journey, and that journey can start through watching a Netflix program, going down a rabbit hole into YouTube, and they think, what, I'm going to go further into this. And I'm going to go to Peru. And that's their calling. But I think they have to remember that most people have been trained to go and have a conversation with their MD. That's what they've been taught. And there was a moment in time, not necessarily such an American thing, but certainly some sort of countries where doctors were viewed as gods. They had these extraordinary powers, and what they said went. They were never wrong, never questioned. So there's a lot of ingrained belief in terms of the significance of what your doctor tells you. So most people will follow that path in terms of having a conversation. What we've got to try and ensure is that, when they present to that doctor has been informed, because we cannot rely on the training that they've not had. Got to give them the resources and the information. And, I think a lot has changed. If you were to go into a doctor a few years ago, unless it was the most enlightened one, and say, "I want to access MDMA, for my trauma," they would throw you out. It's not a drug dealer. What do you think this place is? Now I think there's a really good chance that the response would be, "Oh, well, it's actually very close to being approved. I've seen a documentary on it quite recently. Don't know everything about it, but I'm learning." And I've seen that with certainly younger medical professionals. They may not necessarily spark the conversation, but when they know what I'm involved with, they will start to ask questions, and they've read, the Michael Pollan books, and they've they started to have their alternative learning sources. So, those are going to be really important pathways. And we've got to put as much focus and energy in terms of supporting people who want to access their traditional methods and not cheapen somebody's experience in a leisure setting or a festival. Those can be life-changing moments for those people and take them on a very different direction in life, and not for us. And I say this as somebody who's a biotech investor, to cheapen those experiences or to demean somebody following a less conventional route. We're not always right in the modern Western medical framework. But a large majority of people will follow, the more conventional routes. And we've got to make sure that those medical practitioners well-versed in these new modalities and can make referrals, to the appropriate sources. And we also have to remember, this is a global world, and healthcare is not the same as it is in the US, in many, many other places in the world. So healthcare differs so significantly. And we always try and balance that conversation, because I think there's a risk, no disrespect to Americans, but we believe that it's the same everywhere, isn't it? No, it's not. It's fundamentally done really, really differently. You've got some good bits, you've got some bad bits, the same for everywhere else. So that's a big part of learning that, market access is not going to be achieved in the same way in every single country in the world. Forget about, people going to the original routes and the social routes. Just the medical routes are going to be fundamentally different in so many different countries. And if you are bringing a therapeutic to market, your job to your shareholders and to the patients you want to care for is to get that therapeutic into as many markets as possible. And I'm still gobsmacked when I found myself reading Johnson & Johnson's Spravato guidelines in Arabic for the Saudi Arabian market.
Oh, wow!
Where market access has been achieved. So
I think it starts off with education too. We have, especially a lot of my patients at the clinic, they come to me, they don't get the referral from their doctors. We reach out to their doctors, and it's when the patients are educated and they're informed, they have a say in their health. They reach out to their doctors.
And I think this is one of the very few classes of medicine where patients really do want to be informed. They go off on a journey of discovery. So accuracy of information is really, really important. But, God forbid, you were, needing oncology treatments. The likelihood of you going away and reading many books on the subject and watching a series on Netflix and diving into videos on YouTube before you accepted that oncology treatment is really low. But this is really unique in that, patients do. Very similar, I think, to new emerging categories such as longevity medicines, where people become really, really absorbed in, the science before they actually, activate.
Wow. We have covered so much ground. This has been such an amazing talk. You have been transformational in the psychedelic space. With the Conscious Fund, with Microdose.
Tried to do my bit.
No, when I had the opportunity to knowing that I was going to talk to you, I just remember my first Microdose Wonderland conference, you being on stage talking. I'm like, I get to interview him. It was definitely very eye-opening, my first experience, and I look forward to it every year. For the listeners out there, if you're interested, Microdose Wonderland conference is a few weeks away, November 9th through the 11th in Miami. You can actually check out our description below. You can have a website, and I will be having a discount code if you want some tickets there. But if you want to learn and just meet so many different people, from clinicians to shamans to investors, biotech, anything that you could imagine is possible there at the Wonderland Conference. So thank you so much, Richard.
Pleasure. Yeah, no, I mean, just to sort of wrap on that, I made a very interesting friendship at the last Wonderland with my Uber driver, who was dropping me off She said, "Oh, well, what's this?" I said, "It's a psychedelic medicine conference." She said, "You're not going to believe this." She says, "I'm actually a doctor and I'm not practicing at the moment because I'm kind of a bit disillusioned. And I've always wanted to look at psychedelic medicine as a way of helping people." I said, "Well, wow, that's incredible." She says, do you know the people who are organizing it?" "I'm organizing it." She said, "I'd love to come in." I was like, "Well, let's swap numbers." And she's now gone and she's working in the psychedelic medicine space. I mean, what a calling. I mean, the calling was the Uber app.
A beautiful connection.
A beautiful connection. But I think just to encourage your listeners and your viewers, it is a show which is designed for everybody to take something away. We have 3 stages. You can dip in and out different conversations. If you want to get really nerdy on the science, that's there for you. If you want to look at it as sort of a political and a social and economic perspective or an investment perspective, that's there for you as well. And that's what we sort of really pride ourselves on, is just the diversity of the range of conversations that we include.
Yes. Yeah. The connections I've made have been still today, very close friendships and colleagues and business associations have been made through Wonderland. So thank you.
Wonderful. Look forward to seeing you in Miami very soon.
Oh, wonderful. Yes. You have a safe flight over.
Thank you.
Well, that is a wrap. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. This is the end of this week's dose of psychedelic healing. You have a beautiful night.